Okay, so today we're gonna dive back in to a really, really interesting period, like late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know about you, but I just find it fascinating. It's this time when so much of what people thought they knew about, like humanity and the world, it just gets like completely upended.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
totally.
Yeah.
Like a massive intellectual earthquake. We're talking Darwin, Nietzsche, Freud, all these guys who are like, hey, maybe we're not who we thought we were. And then you've got this whole imperialism thing exploding, new technologies making it all possible. And then, of course, the feminist movement starts really picking up steam.
Right. And it's not just like ideas floating around. You've got Bismarck over there building this crazy alliance system, trying to keep Europe from like, blowing itself up. And then Wilhelm II comes along and is like, nah, I'm going to do my own thing, and basically throws a wrench in the whole works.
Exactly. And then we've got, good old Tsar Nicholas II trying to drag Russia, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. And, well, we all know how that ends up. 1905, revolution in the streets.
So, yeah, it's a lot, right?
Yeah.
But it's all connected. And that's what we're going to do in this deep dive, try to connect those dots and like see the big picture of this era. Like, how did we get from there to here? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So let's start with, like you said, how our understanding of humanity itself was changing. And for that, we've got to start with Darwin. Now, Darwin didn't just come up with this stuff out of nowhere. He was influenced by, like, Thomas Malthus. Malthus had this idea that human populations, they tend to grow faster than their food supply, right? So what happens when you have, like, way more people than food?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? You get competition, struggle for resources, like not exactly a recipe for a peaceful, happy world.
Exactly. So Darwin, he takes this idea of struggle and applies it to the natural world. He's on this voyage, the HMS Beagle, and he's seeing this competition playing out everywhere, like with plants and animals. And he comes up with this theory of evolution by natural selection. It basically says that organisms with traits that are better suited to their environment, they're more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits. So what's the whole point of this evolutionary game?
Pass on your genes, right? Like,
Yeah.
from an evolutionary perspective, that's all that matters. If your genes don't make it to the next generation, you're out of the game.
Exactly. And Darwin, he writes this book on the origin of species, and he basically says, look, this process, this natural selection, this is how we got all this diversity of life on Earth, humans included. Like, we're not some special exception. We evolved just like everything else.
And that was a huge deal, right? Because for centuries, especially in the West, people believed that humans were like God's special creation, made in his image, totally separate from and superior to animals.
Right, exactly. Think about the creation story. Adam and Eve created last. It's like the grand finale. And Darwin comes along and he's basically like, nope, we're part of this whole messy, competitive, natural world, just like a beetle or a bird.
And people freaked out, right? I mean, it challenged everything they thought they knew about themselves, their place in the universe.
Yeah.
Especially religious folks.
Oh, for sure. It was like a direct attack on their beliefs. Now, it's important to remember, Darwin himself never said that some humans were, like, better than others. He wasn't about that.
But other people took his ideas and, well, they twisted them, to fit their own agendas.
Yeah, like with social Darwinism, that's where they took this survival of the fittest thing and used it to justify racism, imperialism, like saying that certain cultures were more evolved, more fit to rule. And that was a total distortion of what Darwin was actually talking about.
Oh, he was talking about biological adaptation, not like some kind of racial hierarchy. But those ideas, they had a real impact,
Yeah.
They were used to justify some really terrible things.
So we've got Darwin kind of shaking up the biological understanding of humanity. But then you've got Nietzsche over in Germany challenging us on a whole other level. He was worried that society was becoming too soft, as he put it. What did he mean by that?
Yeah, he wasn't a fan of all this, like, equality and democracy stuff. He thought it was making people weak, holding back the truly exceptional individuals.
Exactly. He thought that all this focus on making everyone equal, valuing humility, it was stifling the potential for greatness. He wanted to see individuals who would rise above the masses, create their own values, embrace struggle, and he called this individual the Übermensch, like the Superman.
So, like, how would Nietzsche view a situation that we might see every day?
Let's say you've got a student who gets a perfect score on a test and then, like, brags about it to everyone. Most people will probably think that's, like, arrogant, not very humble. But Nietzsche, he might see it differently. He might say, hey, this kid's not afraid to stand out, to assert their excellence. They're embracing their strength, challenging others to step up their game. He saw progress coming from this kind of, like, individual striving, even conflict, rather than everyone just trying to get along.
I mean, it's an interesting thought, but it definitely goes against a lot of what we value today, right? Like,
Yeah.
we tend to encourage humility, cooperation.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Nietzsche's ideas, they're controversial, to say the least. We're not saying we agree with all of them.
Yeah, especially when you consider how some of his ideas, like the will to power and the battle of wills, were, well, let's just say, misused by certain people.
Yeah, like the Nazis. They definitely took some of Nietzsche's ideas and twisted them to fit their own horrific ideology. Which, again, shows how powerful ideas can be, how they can be interpreted in different ways, and how they can be used for good or for evil.
So we've got Darwin, Nietzsche, both challenging what it means to be human, but then you've got Freud coming at it from a totally different angle, right? He's all about what's going on inside our heads.
Exactly. Freud, he was challenging this Enlightenment idea that humans are rational beings, that we make decisions based on logic and reason. He's like, nope, there's a whole lot more going on beneath the surface. He's talking about the unconscious mind, this vast reservoir of thoughts, feelings, desires, memories, stuff we're not even aware of. And he's saying that this unconscious mind, it has a huge influence on our behavior.
And he comes up with this model of the psyche, with the ids, the ego, and the superego, right? Like, how do those all
Yeah.
fit together?
So think of the id as like the primal part of you, the part that just wants instant gratification, pleasure, no matter what. It's like you're in a boring meeting and the id's like, let's get out of here, go get a burger.
Okay, I can relate to that.
Right.
And the superego, that's like the opposite, right?
Yeah, the superego is like your internalized set of rules, morality, what's right and wrong. It's the voice that says, no, you can't just leave the meeting. You have to be responsible, stay, and be polite.
So it's like the angel on your shoulder, basically.
Pretty much. And then the ego, it's stuck in the middle, trying to balance the demands of the id and the superego. It's like the mediator, trying to find realistic ways to satisfy the id's desires without completely breaking all the superego's rules.
Sounds exhausting.
It can be. And Freud, he was really big on the idea that these basic drives, especially sexual urges, libido, they were like primary motivators for human behavior.
So not exactly the rational creatures we thought we were.
Right. And Freud, he even came up with these concepts like the Oedipus complex, the Electra complex, to explain these like deep-seated, often unconscious desires and rivalries that shape us early in life.
And dreams, right. Freud was all about dreams. He thought they were like a secret code to the unconscious mind.
Exactly. He saw dreams as a way for the unconscious to express itself, to communicate stuff that we're not consciously aware of. And he developed all these methods for interpreting dreams, trying to decipher the symbols and hidden meanings.
So, like, what about that story of Jose dreaming about being chased by a tiny Clifford the big red dog? What would Freud say about that?
Well, he might say that even though Clifford is small in the dream, maybe Jose is feeling overwhelmed by something in his life, like something that he feels like he should be able to handle but is still stressing him out. Or maybe the fact that Clifford is usually friendly, but in the dream he's aggressive, maybe that symbolizes a betrayal or a situation where something Jose normally finds comforting is now causing him anxiety. It's all about interpretation.
So when we put Darwin, Nietzsche, and Freud all together, it's like they're painting a pretty different picture of humanity than what people were used to, right?
Totally. It's a much more complex, less flattering picture. We're not these perfectly rational, divinely created beings. We're driven by primal urges, shaped by evolution, influenced by forces we don't even understand.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about imperialism, which was like a huge thing in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
European powers were just gobbling up territory all over Africa and Asia. What was driving this land grab?
Well, you had several factors at play. First, you've got the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which creates this massive demand for raw materials, stuff like rubber, minerals, cotton, to fuel their factories. And they see colonies as a way to get those resources.
Right, so it's like, we need stuff, let's go get it.
Exactly. Plus, these new colonies, they become markets for European goods.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win for them. They get the resources and they get guaranteed customers for their products.
So it's not just about getting rich, it's about having somewhere to spend all that money too.
Exactly. And then you've got this rise of nationalism where countries are competing with each other, trying to prove who's the most powerful. And having a big empire, that's like the ultimate status symbol.
So my empire's bigger than your empire.
Pretty much. And then you can't forget about social Darwinism, which was this like twisted version of Darwin's ideas. People started applying the survival of the fittest concept to entire societies and cultures, and they used it to justify imperialism, saying things like, well, we're obviously more evolved, so it's our duty to conquer and civilize these inferior people.
Yeah, it was a really messed up way of using Darwin's ideas to justify their own greed and ambition.
Totally. And it led to a lot of exploitation and brutality, but, it wasn't just ideas that made imperialism possible. There were some key technological advancements that played a big role.
Like steamships, right? Those things were game changers.
Oh, yeah. Steamships made it possible to travel up rivers, go inland, explore and control areas that were previously inaccessible. Plus, they could transport troops and supplies much faster.
Making it much easier to conquer and maintain control of these vast territories. What else made it easier for them to, actually survive in these new places?
Well, the discovery of quinine was a big one. Quinine, it's a drug that prevents malaria, which is a huge problem for Europeans in tropical areas. Before quinine, a lot of them would just die from malaria. But with quinine, they could actually survive and operate in these regions.
So they could go where they couldn't go before and stay alive. And then, of course, there's the whole military technology thing.
Oh, yeah. The machine gun, that was a game changer. It gave European armies a massive advantage over indigenous populations who were often fighting with, spears and swords.
So basically, they had the technology, the resources, and let's just say the lack of moral scruples to conquer and exploit large parts of the world.
Pretty much. Okay, so let's move on to the feminist movement, which was also gaining momentum during this period. What were these women fighting for?
Well, at its core, it was about equality, right? They wanted the same legal and civil rights as men. And for many of them, the biggest goal was getting the right to vote.
Exactly. But even within the movement, there were different opinions on why women should have the vote.
Right, like some of the older, more moderate activists, they argued that women would bring a more compassionate, nurturing approach to politics. Like they'd be the voice of reason and peace.
Yeah, they were kind of playing into traditional gender stereotypes, but they were trying to use them to their advantage.
And then you had the younger, more radical feminists who were like, no way, we deserve the vote because we're equal human beings, period. We don't need to justify it based on some idea of what women are supposed to be like.
Exactly. And these different perspectives led to different tactics, too. The more moderate groups, they were into traditional methods like organizing marches, writing letters to politicians, signing petitions, giving speeches.
Like playing by the rules, trying to work within the system.
Exactly. But the more radical wing, they were like, screw the rules, we need to make some noise.
And they made a lot of noise, right? Like the Pankhurst family in Britain, they were leading the charge.
Oh, yeah, they were the rock stars of the movement. They were bombing mailboxes, smashing windows, disrupting political meetings, you name it. And they were really good at using the media to get their message out.
And they weren't afraid to get arrested either. They'd go on hunger strikes in prison, forcing the authorities to force feed them.
Which, of course, made the government look even worse. It was like, look what they're doing to these women who just want the right to vote.
And then there was Emily Wilding Davison, who took things to a whole other level.
Yeah, she was like the ultimate martyr for the cause. She did all sorts of crazy stuff, like setting fire to mailboxes, throwing herself down prison stairs. And then, of course, there was the Epsom Derby incident.
Oh, man, that was tragic. She stepped in front of the king's horse during the race, and, well, she didn't survive.
It was a really dramatic and shocking event. And it really divided public opinion. Some people saw her as a hero, others thought she was a fanatic.
But it definitely got people talking about the issue of women's suffrage.
For sure. And eventually, in 1918, British women over the age of 30 got the right to vote. And then, in 1928, they got full suffrage equal to men. So all that struggle, all that sacrifice, it eventually paid off.
Okay, so let's jump back to Europe and talk about Bismarck and his alliance system. He was all about keeping Germany safe.
Absolutely. His whole goal was to prevent a two-front war, where Germany would be fighting enemies on both sides. He knew Germany was strong, but he didn't think they could win a war against multiple major powers at once.
So he creates this whole system of alliances to keep France isolated and prevent a war.
Exactly. His masterpiece was the Triple Alliance, which brought together Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. They agreed that if one of them was attacked, the others would come to their aid.
So it's like a big, you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us kind of deal.
Exactly. But Bismarck, he also knew that he had to keep Russia on his good side. So he negotiated this separate agreement with them called the Reinsurance Treaty.
which was more like a let's not attack each other unless absolutely necessary kind of agreement.
Right. And for a while, it all worked pretty well. Europe was relatively stable, France was isolated, and Germany was safe.
But then along comes Kaiser Wilhelm II, who's got a very different personality than Bismarck.
Oh yeah, Wilhelm, he was much more impulsive, more ambitious. He wanted Germany to be a global superpower, and he wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers to get there.
He didn't really respect Bismarck, did he?
Not really. He thought Bismarck was old-fashioned, out of touch. So in 1890, he fires Bismarck and decides to run foreign policy himself.
Which turned out to be a big mistake, right?
Yeah. Wilhelm, he makes a few crucial decisions that totally unravel Bismarck's careful system. First, he lets the reinsurance treaty with Russia expire.
Which basically pushes Russia right into the arms of France.
Exactly. Now, Germany's got enemies on both sides, just like Bismarck was trying to avoid. And then Wilhelm starts building up the German Navy, challenging Britain's dominance at sea.
Yeah, that was not a good move. Britain was not happy about that at all.
Nope. And that leads to an arms race between Britain and Germany, which just increases tensions and makes war more likely. And then, to top it all off, Britain decides that they need allies. So they join forces with France and Russia, forming the Triple Entente.
So now you've got two armed camps facing each other, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente.
Yeah.
And it's only a matter of time before something sparks a war between them.
Exactly. So Bismarck's system, which was designed to keep the peace, it gets completely dismantled by Wilhelm's actions. And that sets the stage for World War I.
Okay, so let's move on to Russia, where Tsar Nicholas II is trying to modernize the country, but things aren't exactly going smoothly.
Yeah, Russia was still very much an agrarian society, but they were trying to catch up with the rest of Europe industrially. And Nicholas, he wasn't exactly the most dynamic leader.
He was more of a family man than a political mastermind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he relies on advisors like Sergei Witt to try and push through some reforms, like improving agriculture, building railroads, expanding mining, and steel production.
And they actually achieved something pretty impressive. The Trans-Siberian Railway.
Oh yeah, that was a massive undertaking. This railway, it stretched over 5,700 miles, connecting the east and west of Russia. It was a huge feat of engineering and a symbol of Russia's ambitions.
But despite these efforts, Russia was still facing a lot of problems, right?
Yeah. There were food shortages, poverty, terrible working conditions in the new factories, and the middle class, they were getting restless. They wanted more political freedom, more say in how the country was run.
And Nicholas, he wasn't exactly giving them what they wanted, was he?
Nope. He was pretty resistant to change. And then Russia gets into a war with Japan and gets completely humiliated.
Yeah, that was a big blow to Nicholas's prestige. It showed everyone that Russia wasn't as strong as they thought they were.
Exactly. And that defeat, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back. It led to the 1905 revolution.
And they all started with Bloody Sunday, right?
Yeah, Bloody Sunday was a turning point. You had all these peaceful protesters marching to the Tsar's palace, asking for better conditions, more rights. And Nicholas, he panics and orders his troops to fire on the crowd.
Hundreds of people were killed. It was a massacre.
It was, and it completely destroyed whatever trust people had left in the Tsar.
So how does Nicholas respond to this, full-blown revolution?
Well, he's forced to make some concessions. He creates the Duma, which is like a parliament, supposed to give the people a voice in government.
So it's like a step towards democracy.
Kind of, but Nicholas, he still held most of the power. He could dissolve the Duma whenever he wanted, and he often ignored their advice.
So the 1905 revolution, it didn't really fix the underlying problems in Russia.
Nope. It just kind of papered over the cracks. The tensions were still there, simmering beneath the surface, and it set the stage for the even bigger revolution that would come in 1917.
Well, that's a story for another deep dive, I guess. But it's clear that the late 19th, early 20th century, it was a time of massive change and upheaval. Like, the whole world was in flux.
Absolutely. From our understanding of human nature to the balance of power in Europe to the fight for equality, everything was being questioned, challenged, redefined.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how did all these events and ideas shape the world we live in today? Which of these shifts had the most lasting impact?
That's a great question to consider, and it's one that we'll probably be wrestling with for a long time to come. But one thing's for sure, it was a fascinating and pivotal era that deserves our attention.
Absolutely. So we hope you enjoyed this deep dive, and we encourage you to keep exploring these topics, to keep asking questions, and to keep learning. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Okay, so today we are diving deep into Europe in the late 1800s.
All right.
And you've brought us like a ton of material here, lecture transcripts, PDFs, even a YouTube transcript. It looks like a pretty fascinating but kind of volatile time, wouldn't you say? Lots of change happening all at once.
Yeah, definitely. And all these changes are, well, they're all kind of tangled up together, you know?
Right, exactly. Like, it's not just one thing happening in isolation. You've got all these technological advancements going on at the same time as these, like, really radical new ways of thinking about society and humanity. And then on top of that, you've got countries like Serbia with these, big ambitions for power and influence, especially the Balkans.
Yeah, all those things kind of feeding into each other. It's a recipe for, well,
For some serious upheaval. Okay, so let's start untangling this a bit. Why don't we begin with a look at what life was like for everyday people in Europe during this period? The late 19th century saw the Second Industrial Revolution. Right. But from what I'm seeing in these sources, it wasn't just a repeat of the first one. Life was actually getting better for a lot of people in some pretty tangible ways.
Yeah, that's a big difference from the first industrial revolution. Like, people were actually living longer, they had more food, better health care, even a bit of disposable income.
So they could actually see and feel these improvements in their lives.
Exactly. And these improvements, they weren't just like more of the same. We're talking fundamental shifts in technology. Iron gives way to steel, which is much stronger, obviously. Steam and water power, well, they're kind of limited, right? But then you have this massive expansion of electricity. It's so much more versatile.
And you can't forget about the railroads.
Yeah.
And oil.
Right. Railroads and oil. Think rows. Railroads, oil, steel, electricity. And all this leads to a huge boom in industry. Germany in particular, they really took off during this time. They even surpassed Britain in steel production, which, probably caused a bit of anxiety over in London.
I bet. Talk about a power shift. And with more money and free time, people start looking for new ways to have fun, right?
Oh, absolutely. You see the rise of things like theaters, musical performances, even these newfangled amusement parks. And workers were starting to gain some leverage too, better wages, more time off. So yeah, people definitely had more options for how to spend their leisure time.
So it's not all doom and gloom like the first industrial revolution. Cities are actually becoming more livable too, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Better sanitation, cleaner water, and this is key, people are finally starting to understand how germs work.
Thank you, Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister.
Exactly. Antiseptics, pasteurization, these discoveries were game changers. Death rates from infectious diseases plummeted. It's a huge turning point in public health.
Speaking of turning points, what about the role of women during this era? It seems like things were changing for them too, but maybe not as quickly or as dramatically as we might think.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, that's for sure. New opportunities did open up, especially for middle-class women teaching, nursing, even this new field of social work. Working-class women, they found jobs as file clerks, shop assistants, telephone operators. Apparently, a woman's voice was considered more, more pleasing on the phone.
Interesting.
So yeah, more job options, definitely more social freedom. But here's the thing. Marriage rates, they stayed really high. And that was mostly because of economics, A woman's wage was often based on the assumption that she was married or would be soon.
So they were kind of expected to get married.
Pretty much. And certain professions, like becoming a doctor or a lawyer, those were still mostly off limits to women. But there is one interesting trend. Birth rates started to decline, especially in cities.
So more opportunities, it's still a long way to go. Now, one group that was starting to gain more political power during this time was the working class, particularly working class men. A lot of European countries were expanding voting rights.
Right. That's a big deal. It's a real shift in the political landscape, a recognition that the working class deserves a voice. And at the same time, you have this big push for education. Lots of countries started offering state-funded elementary education for all children.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
An educated workforce is a productive workforce.
Right. But there's another interesting aspect to this. A lot of this education, it was infused with a heavy dose of nationalism. You could see this as a way to create a stronger sense of national unity, maybe even prepare citizens for future conflict.
Right. Kind of like getting them ready to fight for their country.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so we've talked about the societal changes happening in Europe. Now let's shift our focus to the Balkans, specifically to Serbia. Our sources paint a pretty clear picture of Serbia as a rising power with some pretty big ambitions, and that this was a major source of tension in the region.
Yeah, the late 19th century was, well, it was a time of intense nationalism in the Balkans. And a big reason for that was the decline of the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottomans weakened, their grip on the region loosened, and everyone started scrambling for power and influence. Serbia, Austria-Hungary, Russia, they were all vying for control.
And it seems like Serbia wasn't just content with holding on to what it already had. They had a much bigger vision, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Serbian leadership, they wanted to unite all the Slavic peoples in the Balkans under Serbian rule. They dreamed of creating this big, powerful, pan-Slavic state. But of course, this put them on a collision course with Austria-Hungary.
Because Austria-Hungary controlled a lot of territory with large Slavic population.
Exactly. And then you've got Russia. Russia also saw itself as a protector of the Slavic people. They were kind of like a big brother to Serbia, and they shared this vision of pan-Slavism. But even though they had this shared goal, there was also a bit of a rivalry between them, kind of like, who's going to be the top dog in this new Slavic world order?
So you have the Ottoman Empire collapsing, creating this power vacuum. And then you've got all these different groups, each with their own idea of what the future should look like. And right in the middle of all this is Serbia, this ambitious, rising power that wants to unite the Slavic people under its banner. No wonder things were so tense.
Yeah, it was a powder keg, for sure. You had all these new independent nation-states popping up, each with their own strong sense of national identity. And then you throw in these competing claims to territory and the ambitions of larger powers like Russia and Austria-Hungary. It was a recipe for disaster.
It's kind of amazing that a major war didn't break out sooner.
Sure.
Okay, so we've talked about the political and social upheavals, but we also need to address these big intellectual shifts that were happening at the same time. You've got thinkers like Darwin, Nietzsche, and Freud all challenging the traditional ways of looking at humanity and society.
Yeah, those guys really shook things up. Darwin, with his theory of evolution, well, he basically said that humans aren't this special creation, that we're just another animal subject to the same laws of nature. This really challenged religious beliefs, but it also opened the door to new ways of thinking about human difference.
Like, if we're just animals, then maybe some of us are more evolved than others.
Exactly. And then you've got Nietzsche. He was all about power and the will to power. He had this idea of the Übermensch, the superior individual who rises above the constraints of society and creates their own values. And this, this could be interpreted in a very nationalistic way.
Right, like our nation is the Übermensch. And then there's Freud, delving into the unconscious mind.
Right, Freud. He was arguing that humans aren't these rational beings we like to think we are. He said that we're driven by all these unconscious desires and impulses that we're not even aware of.
Which kind of throws a wrench into the whole Enlightenment idea of human progress, doesn't it?
It definitely complicates things. But what's important here is that these weren't just abstract philosophical debates. These ideas, they had the power to shape how people saw themselves, their societies, even their nations.
Okay, so to recap, we have European society undergoing this massive transformation thanks to the Second Industrial Revolution. Life is getting better in a lot of ways, but there are also new social and economic tensions emerging. At the same time, the Balkans are a hotbed of nationalism, with Serbia's growing power and ambition as a major catalyst for instability. And underpinning all of this is this whole intellectual revolution that's questioning some of the most fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human. It's a lot.
It is. And the really crucial thing is that all these factors, they were all intertwined. Industrialization, it provided the resources for nations to arm themselves, and these new intellectual currents, well, they offered new ways to justify those nationalistic ambitions. And Serbia's goals in the Balkans, that became the flashpoint, the place where all these tensions could potentially erupt.
Right, it's like all these different sources converging at the same time. So for our listeners out there, hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this really crucial, if complex, period in European history. We often think of progress as this straight line, this upward trajectory, but the late 19th century shows us that it's not always so simple. You can have amazing advances in technology and quality of life, and at the same time, you can have these simmering tensions and rivalries that could easily boil over into conflict.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it raises a really important question for all of us to think about. How precarious do you think the situation in Europe had become by the early 20th century? Were the seeds of a major conflict already sown during this period? Given everything we've talked about, it's hard not to see World War I as almost inevitable.
It's definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.